frozen broccoli might actually be healthier than the fresh stuff in your fridge. That sounds ridiculous, right? But research from the late 2010s through 2025 shows that freezing vegetables at peak harvest can actually lock in more nutrients than produce that spends days losing vitamins in transit and storage. University of Georgia comparisons even found frozen produce often held equal or higher levels of certain vitamins. And this matters because ultra-processed foods now make up over half of the average American diet, and nearly 2/3 for younger people. By the end, you'll see which kinds of processing can actually help you, and which ones may be quietly working against you. But before we get into that, we need to clear up a basic problem. What does processed even mean? What does processed even mean? When most of us hear the word processed, what jumps to mind are chips, candy bars, or microwave pizza. But here's the twist. That bag of frozen peas in your freezer or the carton of pasteurized milk in your fridge are also processed. They don't carry the same reputation as cheese puffs or soda, yet they technically sit in the same category. That's the problem. The word is so broad that it lumps together foods that have nothing in common nutritionally. So when someone claims, "I avoid processed foods," they might be holding a jar of peanut butter or a loaf of whole wheat bread without realizing those are processed too. This fuzziness gets even more confusing when processed is treated as a synonym for unhealthy. Processing isn't one single thing. It's a spectrum. Washing an apple, baking bread, curing bacon, and turning corn into high fructose syrup all count, but they are not equivalent. Throwing yogurt, deli meat, canned beans, and soda into the same bucket oversimplifies the picture. That makes it tough to answer questions like, is frozen spinach fine? Or does baking bread make it suspect? Without something more precise, processed becomes almost useless as a health term. To fix that, researchers often turn to the NOVA classification system, which breaks foods into clearer categories. At the base are unprocessed or minimally processed foods. That's the items like fresh fruit, raw vegetables, dried beans, nuts, plain rice, or raw cuts of meat. These might be clean, chopped, frozen, or dried, but they still look and function much like their natural form. The next step is processed culinary ingredients. Things like sugar, oils, butter, or salt that are extracted from natural foods and used to prepare meals. Then there are processed foods, which combine those basic ingredients with something else for preservation or flavor. Examples would be canned tuna, cheese, bread, or jam. There's still a clear connection to the original food source, but human intervention has reshaped it. Finally, at the top are ultra-processed foods. These are industrial products built from refined substances, flavor additives, stabilizers, colorings, or emulsifiers, ingredients you wouldn't find in the home kitchen. Think of soda, instant noodles, packaged snack cakes, or those breakfast cereals that seem more engineered than grown. Researchers use the NOVA categories to compare diets because it captures the type and purpose of processing, not just the fact that something has been altered. As a result, it's widely adopted in health studies around the world, including large population analyses reviewed by organizations like the WHO. This framework is important because it helps separate harmless or even beneficial forms of processing from the kinds more likely linked to poor outcomes. Pasteurizing milk prevents dangerous pathogens. Freezing broccoli preserves nutrients. Fortifying grains with iron or adding iodine to salt addresses public health needs. These are processed foods, and in many cases, their processing makes them safer and more nutritious. It's when you move into the ultra-processed category, where food is engineered with additives or stripped and reconstructed from refined ingredients, that problems emerge. Seeing the system this way reshapes the everyday conversation. Instead of saying processed equals bad, it becomes clear that everything we eat sits somewhere on a scale. A sliced cucumber? Technically processed. A candy bar wrapped in foil? Also processed, just at the far end of the spectrum. The critical difference is how far food drifts from its original state and why certain steps are introduced. And here's where the big question starts forming. If all foods exist somewhere along this processing spectrum, how much of the average modern diet now sits in that upper ultra-processed tier? The answer, as recent studies show, is steadily climbing, and it has consequences far beyond how we shop the grocery store. The surprising growth of ultra-processed diets. So let's step back and ask the bigger question. How much of the food on our plates today actually counts as ultra-processed? Researchers keep returning to that issue because the shift in recent years has been faster and broader than many expected. A decade ago, the worry was that sodas, snack cakes, and frozen meals were creeping too far into daily diets. But the most recent reports show that these products are not only entrenched, they've expanded their share even more. Predictions that consumption would eventually taper off as people became more health conscious haven't played out. Instead, supermarket shelves and restaurant menus continue to lean heavily toward items that blur the line between meal and manufactured product. Population-level surveys give a clear picture of just how far this has gone. Instead of leveling off, ultra-processed foods have steadily crowded out minimally processed staples in many diets. That means they aren't just occasional treats anymore, they're everyday meals. In countries like the US and UK, they account for a very large slice of caloric intake, and other regions are trending in the same direction. What's striking in the 2025 data isn't only the increase from previous years, but how normalized this eating pattern has become. For many households, packaged foods aren't backup options anymore. They form the reliable base of breakfast, lunches, and dinners. Walk through a big box grocery store and that reality is on display. Instead of carts filled with fresh produce and raw ingredients, shoppers often leave with freezer meals, bottled drinks, and boxes of ready-to-eat snacks. A full week of eating can be assembled from packages without ever chopping vegetables or seasoning a dish. And while this setup offers speed and consistency, it also shows up in the numbers. The CDC's 2021 to 2023 analysis reported that ultra-processed foods now provide 55% of total calories in the average U.S. diet. Among American youth, the figure climbs even higher, reaching 61.9%. Nature's reviews confirm that in the US and UK the share sits close to 60%, while other nations report lower but rising levels. It's important to look at that breakdown carefully. The processed calories on your plate might come from boxed cereals, frozen dinners, energy drinks, or packaged breads that don't seem problematic on their own. But when combined, they overwhelm traditional patterns built around fresh vegetables, whole grains, and unprocessed proteins. Think of your daily calories as a pie chart. The biggest slice now comes not from farms or kitchens, but from laboratories and factories designed to produce foods that last on shelves, travel well, and deliver flavor at low cost. These advantages explain their grip. Ultra-processed foods are engineered to be cheap, convenient, and satisfying in ways that outcompete raw ingredients. But nutritional compromises often accompany those benefits, especially over the long term. The shift isn't only about consumer preference, it reflects broader changes in the food system itself. Large-scale retail, global supply chains, and commercial marketing create an environment where choosing ultra-processed foods feels default rather than optional. And the trend doesn't just apply to teenagers reaching for snack bars or energy drinks. Adults under time pressure buy ready meals instead of cooking, while many older consumers also lean more on packaged foods because of convenience or accessibility. That pattern is now global. As incomes rise and supermarkets expand in developing regions, younger generations raised on packaged options are moving away from food traditions their parents relied on. In these contexts, fortified or re-engineered products can even seem more modern, affordable, and on the surface, nutritionally competitive. That's why researchers stress that the 2025 findings aren't just about statistics on a page. They describe a lifestyle shift, where avoiding ultra-processed food altogether would mean rewiring shopping lists, choosing against what dominates nearly every aisle, and setting aside convenience for routine cooking. For many households, that feels less like moderation and more like opting out of mainstream food culture altogether. This isn't a marginal detail in nutrition science anymore. It's a central feature of how people around the world are eating daily. Tracing how it developed helps explain the scale of the change. As societies urbanized, the demand for shelf-stable foods grew. Transportation networks and global trade encouraged longer supply chains, while supermarkets adapted their space to highlight packaged products. By the 2020s, processed options weren't additions to diets, they were the backbone. Aggressive marketing reinforced the perception that modern eating meant quick, reliable, and often highly engineered meals. Decade by decade, the collective diet leaned further away from whole foods toward products that can be stored, shipped, and consumed with minimal effort. So where does that leave us now? In countries like the US, UK, and Canada, ultra-processed items consistently make up more than half of caloric intake, while middle-income and developing nations are climbing towards similar patterns each year. The global landscape shows no sign of tipping back toward traditional cooking on its own. Instead, it points toward a world where ultra-processed products are no longer supplementary. They are the structural foundation of eating. And with more than half of all daily calories now coming from these foods in many regions, the question for researchers isn't just how much we eat, but how that heavy reliance shapes long-term health. Why care? Because higher intake of ultra-processed food is strongly linked with a range of health risks, and recent controlled trials are beginning to narrow down how and why those effects show up. This is where the conversation shifts. Processing isn't always harmful. In fact, certain kinds can preserve vitamins, improve safety, and even make nutrients more available to our bodies. Some of the most surprising examples are sitting quietly in most kitchens already, when processing actually makes food healthier. One of the more surprising truths about modern diets is that certain kinds of processing don't strip food of nutrients, they actually help preserve or even enhance them. While the word process often signals loss or artificial change, some methods interrupt natural decay, keep fragile vitamins intact, or increase how much of a nutrient the body can absorb. Looking closely at common examples like frozen vegetables, canned tomatoes, and cooked carrots shows why so much of the old fresh is always best message needs a more balanced view. Take frozen broccoli. Once a vegetable is picked, its vitamin levels begin to drop. Vitamin C in particular degrades quickly when exposed to air, light, and time. Produce that looks fresh in the supermarket may already have lost much of its natural vitamin load after days in storage and transport. Freezing cuts that process short. When broccoli is blanched and frozen shortly after harvest, the decline in vitamin C and other compounds slows dramatically. Studies comparing frozen and so-called fresh batches consistently show higher preservation in the frozen ones. Of course, no preservation method is perfect. Freezing can lead to slight texture changes, and the blanching step before freezing can reduce some water-soluble vitamins, but overall, nutrient retention remains strong. Canned tomatoes tell a similar story, but with a twist. Heating can actually increase the body's ability to use an antioxidant that's already inside them. Lycopene, the red pigment in tomatoes, is linked in research to a reduced risk of certain chronic diseases. In raw form, though, it isn't as bioavailable. When tomatoes are cooked or canned, cell walls break down and release more lycopene into a form our bodies can absorb. So while canning may reduce some vitamin C, it boosts a compound with protective effects of its own. That balance, trade-offs between different nutrients, is an essential reminder that processing has both costs and gains. Carrots provide another clear case. Their bright color comes from beta-carotene, which the body converts into vitamin A. Heat makes this compound more available, meaning cooked carrots can sometimes deliver more usable vitamin A than raw ones do. Roasting, steaming, or simmering carrots makes the pigment easier to access by breaking down their tough cell structures. Still, there's a catch. At the same time, cooking may reduce amounts of vitamin C and certain B vitamins that are heat sensitive. The overall nutritional impact depends on which nutrients are most relevant for a given diet. When scientists line up frozen, canned, and fresh produce in side-by-side comparisons, a more nuanced picture appears. Green beans, peas, or spinach frozen just after harvest often retain more nutrients than fresh ones that have spent weeks in distribution. Canned beans, despite their reputation, preserve much of their mineral and fiber content while staying kitchen-ready for months. Added sodium can raise concerns, but the nutrients in the beans themselves usually remain intact. The result is that categories many people dismiss as inferior often turn out to be dependable sources of essential compounds. Grains illustrate another side of processing. Oats that are rolled or steel cut have been altered mechanically, but those changes mainly make them easier to prepare and digest without removing their fiber or minerals. Parboiled rice is different from ordinary white rice in that it locks in more of the original B vitamins during the milling process. By gelatinizing starch and sealing nutrients into the grain, parboiling actually improves retention during cooking, a detail that nutrition studies have confirmed. Even the packaging of foods plays a role in nutrient stability. Oxygen exposure speeds the loss of sensitive vitamins. By vacuum sealing or filling packages with protective gases, manufacturers keep compounds like vitamin C or essential fatty acids intact longer. While labeling may still group these items as processed, the engineering is focused on preventing nutritional decline. That means less spoilage and more consistent nutrient availability when the food is finally opened. Pasteurization is another process with an undeserved reputation. Heating milk or juice to control temperatures kills harmful microbes. Critics often claim this step kills nutrients, but in practice, protein, calcium, and most vitamins remain intact. A small fraction of heat-sensitive vitamins can decline, yet the gains in safety and shelf stability outweigh the modest losses. Without pasteurization, foods like milk or juice would spoil rapidly, posing greater health risks and offering less nutritional value overall. Stepping back, a clear pattern emerges. Processing isn't inherently destructive. Rather, it depends on method and context. Freezing or sealing can pause degradation. Heating can increase bioavailability of one nutrient even while lowering another. In other words, processing is more like a toolkit. Some tools protect, some compromise, and many do both at once. Recognizing those differences helps dismantle the old idea that process is automatically a synonym for worse. This also points toward the larger misconception at work. It's easy to imagine processing as a subtractive force that strips food down. Yet many methods are preservative or even additive in terms of how much nutrition your body can actually use. From the broccoli in your freezer to the canned tomatoes in a pasta sauce, evidence shows that these foods may provide benefits equal to or greater than their fresh versions in some contexts. Still, a key qualifier remains. Heat-sensitive compounds like vitamin C and some B vitamins can diminish during cooking, which means no technique guarantees across-the-board improvements. The real takeaway is that the value of processing depends on balancing what's retained, what's gained, and what's lost. This balance is why researchers caution against painting food processing with one broad brush. Some strategies are clearly protective, others more destructive. Freezing, canning, and pasteurizing all address spoilage and safety while preserving much of the nutrient load. Refining grains into white flour or adding excess sugar, on the other hand, depletes quality for the sake of convenience or flavor. By placing all of these under one umbrella term, the nuances vanish. But the reality is far more layered, and appreciating that spectrum helps separate fear-driven assumptions from evidence-based choices. That brings us back to the public conversation. If fresh doesn't always equal best, then neither does processed always equal worst. The evidence on broccoli, tomatoes, and carrots underscores how food science can sometimes help natural nutrients reach us more effectively than they would in an unaltered state. Processing, in these cases, becomes an ally in maintaining or enhancing nutrition, not an enemy. Of course, once discussion shifts from methods like freezing or canning to the kinds of chemical additives often found in ultra-processed foods, the picture changes again. Additives generally carry a reputation for being the least healthy part of modern diets. Yet not every additive deserves the same suspicion, and some researchers are finding surprising cases where those very ingredients may contribute protective effects rather than harm. Weird additives that might extend lifespan. When most people think about food additives, the assumption is simple. If it looks like it belongs in a lab experiment rather than a recipe, it probably isn't something we should be eating. Preservatives, stabilizers, and flavor enhancers almost always trigger suspicion because they're tied in people's mind with neon sodas, snack cakes, and processed meats. That reputation is understandable, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Some of these compounds, often dismissed as unnatural, have roles that go beyond convenience or shelf life. A closer look shows that certain additives reduce harmful byproducts in food, improve safety, or even address nutrient deficiencies that were once widespread. Consider antioxidants. These compounds exist naturally in fruits, vegetables, nuts, and oils, but food makers also add them in concentrated or synthetic forms. Their main job in packaging is to stop fats and oils from breaking down into rancid byproducts. That effect matters not just for taste, but for exposure. Lipid oxidation creates reactive molecules that, if ingested in large amounts, can contribute to cellular stress over time. By keeping those reactions in check inside the food itself, antioxidants may lower the chance of consuming unstable compounds in the first place. On a label, ascorbic acid might sound like a chemical invention when it's really vitamin C stepping in as a preservative and as a nutrient. The benefit to human health doesn't come from extending lifespan directly. That hasn't been demonstrated, but from lowering exposure to harmful oxidation products that accumulate when fats go bad. A related example comes from preservatives that stabilize oils. Decades ago, these were written off as unnecessary or suspect. But more recent understanding of how fats behave under heat and storage has reframed the picture. Oils readily undergo oxidation, producing substances that damage tissues if consumed in quantity. Compounds added to slow that reaction function less like cosmetic additions and more like protective barriers. They don't prolong human life in a direct sense, but they prevent breakdown products from entering the diet, which may reduce risks associated with long-term consumption of rancid fats. The gut microbiome, too, has opened unexpected debates around additives. Some compounds commonly used as sweeteners, certain polyols, for instance, have complex effects in digestion. Overconsumption leads to discomfort, but at controlled levels, these sugar alcohols may selectively nourish strains of bacteria often associated with positive health outcomes. That doesn't mean adding them broadly equates to better health, let alone longer lifespan. What it does show is that the relationship between additives and the gut is not uniformly negative, and under the right conditions, some can function more like prebiotics. Researchers are careful to stress that findings here are preliminary, but the point is simple. Additives can interact with our biology in ways that are more nuanced than the common good versus bad divide. Nitrates and nitrites give another example of nuance. They have been criticized for their role in processed and cured meats, especially when earlier studies suggested links with harmful byproducts in digestion. Yet nitrates are also naturally abundant in leafy greens and beets, foods consistently associated with cardiovascular benefits. Inside the body, these compounds can convert into nitric oxide, which helps relax blood vessels and improve circulation. The regulatory balance here is tricky. Dose, context, and food source matter enormously. Nitrites in bacon don't play out the same as nitrates in spinach. Still, research has demonstrated that under certain circumstances, these compounds contribute to improved blood flow. That doesn't make them universal health additives, but it complicates earlier blanket judgments. Beyond direct chemistry, additives also contribute to health in indirect but important ways, particularly by making food safer. Take antimicrobial agents used to slow bacterial growth. On the surface, all they do is keep bread from molding or juice from fermenting in the bottle. But historically, foodborne pathogens have been major contributors to human mortality. Anything that reduces contamination and spoilage reduces the chance of illness, and public health statistics over the last century show just how transformational that shift has been. While we rarely think of preservatives this way, preventing exposure to pathogens is one of the most straightforward contributions food technology has made to longer, healthier lives. Another overlooked dimension is food fortification. This is where processing and additives don't just preserve nutrients, they actively add them in. Classic examples are vitamin D added to milk, iodine added to table salt. Both interventions came in response to widespread deficiencies. Rickets in children from lack of vitamin D and goiter appearing in regions with insufficient iodine. These additives didn't extend lifespan directly, but they dramatically reduced disease rates across entire populations. They count as additives on the ingredient list, but are remembered in public health research as some of the most effective preventative measures of the 20th century. What's striking about these cases, antioxidants, nitrites in context, antimicrobial preservatives, and vitamin fortification, is that they highlight how additives influence health through protective or preventive pathways. This is different from claiming they may extend human lifespan. The evidence for actual longevity effects in people is not there yet. At best, researchers describe mechanistic studies, lab-based findings, or early associations, but no regulatory agency or rigorous study confirms additives as life-extending. Agencies like WHO and the Joint FAO/WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, JECFA, continue to evaluate safety, and when benefits exist, they're framed in terms of reduced disease risk or stable nutrient intake, not additional years of life. That caveat matters because overstating claims creates false expectations that science doesn't yet support. Still, the indirect benefits are large. Less spoilage means fewer nutrient gaps, especially in regions where access to fresh food can be unpredictable. Shelf stability prevents not just personal waste, but also systemic shortages, ensuring nutrients reach consumers rather than decomposing before they're eaten. Fortification prevents hidden hunger, those deficiencies that undermine health even when calories are abundant. And antimicrobial safety nets quietly protect against pathogens that would otherwise remain a constant threat. If we measure health by lowered disease risk, fewer nutrient deficiencies, and reduced contamination, then certain additives contribute positively to outcomes that influence how long and how well people live. Meanwhile, perception often lags. Molecules like tocopherols, forms of vitamin E, are marketed as supplements in pharmacies, yet criticized as additives when they show up on a label for cereal or bread. Consumers may buy antioxidant capsules for anti-aging benefits while avoiding the exact same compounds added to foods for preservation. That double standard reflects how much context and naming affect trust. It also shows why blanket dismissal of all additives can prevent people from recognizing where science-backed interventions have made measurable differences. Of course, none of this means every additive carries a benefit. Many are included purely for texture, color, or marketing needs without nutritional reason. Some emulsifiers, when consumed frequently, may disturb the gut ecosystem, and excess sugar substitutes can cause digestive distress in doses above safe levels. Distinguishing which additives serve a public health role and which are merely stylistic is essential for informed choices. What matters is not just a long ingredient list, but what each component actually does inside food and potentially in the body. Stepping back, the conversation about additives is less about miracle molecules and more about balance and context. The strongest evidence ties benefits to practical, population-level outcomes, safer food, fewer deficiencies, more reliable nutrient consumption. The open question is whether research in the future will show subtler, direct effects related to aging pathways. For now, it is more accurate to think of additives as tools, sometimes misused, sometimes crucial, but not as shortcuts to longevity. And even when additives play a protective role, there's another side of modern eating that complicates the story. Because while a preservative might keep bread mold-free, the combination of sugar, salt, and fat in countless packaged foods pushes consumption patterns in a different direction. The real puzzle, then, is not just what's inside the ingredient list, but why once we start eating, we find it so difficult to stop. Why our brains can't resist ultra-processed foods. Open a bag of chips intending to eat just a handful, and before you realize it, the bag is almost gone. That isn't simply a matter of poor self-control. It reflects how ultra-processed foods are designed to engage your brain on multiple levels. The salty coating, the crunch, the sweetness and creaminess in a candy bar, these effects aren't accidental. Food engineers deliberately calibrate combinations of fat, sugar, and salt to trigger the brain's reward system. In the industry, there's even a name for the exact level where flavors feel irresistible, the bliss point. Once foods hit it, moderation doesn't feel natural anymore. The neural system most often discussed in this context is the dopamine system. Dopamine isn't about happiness, as is often thought, but about motivation and reinforcement. When you eat foods that taste especially rewarding, dopamine signaling strengthens the urge to repeat that behavior. Evolution shaped us this way because nutrients like sugar, fat, and salt were scarce in the environments where humans developed. A hint of sweetness meant ripe fruit and quick energy. Fat meant long-term fuel. Salt preserved food and maintained normal bodily function. Our ancestors benefited from brains wired to chase these flavors on sight. Modern ultra-processed foods compress those once rare rewards into cheap, constant, and effortless options. Each bite of chips, ice cream, or cookies pushes buttons designed for survival, now adapted to an abundant food environment. Neuroscientists have made this process visible using brain scanning. Functional MRI studies show that ultra-processed foods activate the same reward pathways that respond to behaviors like gambling or nicotine use. The nucleus accumbens, often called the brain's reward hub, lights up when people consume sweet, salty, and fatty combinations. These surges aren't proof that food is addictive in the same formal sense as substances. Researchers point out that the question is still debated, with many agreeing the patterns share addiction-like properties, but stopping short of declaring ultra-processed foods as addictions under clinical criteria. What's clear is that the architecture of the response is strikingly similar. Spikes in dopamine, powerful reinforcement, and persistent cravings even when the body doesn't physically need more fuel. Comparing different foods shows this vividly. Boiled potatoes, bland but filling, barely nudge the reward system. Deep fry them, add salt, and sprinkle seasoning, and suddenly they become far more stimulating to the brain. A plain carrot is mildly sweet and crisp. A slice of carrot cake with sugar and fat layered on top creates intensity that raw carrots never deliver. That layering of multiple rewarding components, fat with sugar, salt with crunch, is what scientists call hyperpalatability. Natural foods typically offer one or two modest pleasure signals at a time. Ultra-processed foods stack several together, creating a super reward that the brain finds disproportionately valuable. Behind the scenes, companies spend enormous effort tuning that effect. Products are tested in sensory laboratories where tasters evaluate minute shifts in crunch, aftertaste, or sweetness. Researchers measure how quickly flavors dissolve, how long aromas linger, and even what decibel level a chip makes when bitten. Every cue is optimized to reinforce eating behaviors. The end result isn't simply food, but a package of synchronized sensory signals that keep people reaching for more. The issue arises because the body's natural satiety signals weren't designed to handle these concentrated inputs. Historically, nutrient-dense foods weren't abundant, and fullness cues had time to slow us down. Fiber, bulk, and gradual digestion all signaled the brain to stop long before overconsumption. Modern processed snacks bypass those breaks. A small piece of candy can equal the calorie load of multiple pieces of fruit, but lacks the fiber and water that would normally fill the stomach. The brain receives intense pleasure before satiety signals have even started working, leading to steady overeating despite sufficient calories. This isn't just theory. Controlled studies confirm it. In 2019, Kevin Hall and colleagues at the National Institutes of Health conducted an inpatient trial in which participants lived in a research ward and rotated between diets heavy in ultra-processed foods and minimally processed foods. When given unlimited access, people consistently consumed about 500 additional calories per day on the ultra-processed diet, despite meals being matched for sweetness, fat, and salt content on paper. They ate faster, felt hungrier sooner, and returned for more. The difference wasn't just in taste perception, but in the way reward-driven motivation overrode the body's built-in checks on appetite. Children provide another window into how strong this mechanism is. Even when stripped of advertising influences, children who are repeatedly exposed to ultra-processed snacks still develop marked preferences for them. That consistency across backgrounds highlights how biological wiring drives the attraction. Marketing can amplify the affect, but the core response starts deeper, rooted in universal pathways of dopamine and reward anticipation that all human brains share. These findings don't mean processed foods literally hook people in the same way as hard drugs. Researchers point out that the field is still divided on whether the label addiction fits, since formal diagnoses involve factors like tolerance, withdrawal, and impairment. But what most agree on is that ultra-processed foods display addiction-like qualities, escalating consumption, cravings, and strong reinforcement loops that mirror patterns found in substance research. That nuance matters, but it doesn't erase the practical reality that breaking habits around ultra-processed foods can be as challenging as stepping away from other reward-driven behaviors. Understanding this framework reshapes the question of responsibility in eating. It becomes less about weak discipline and more about biology interacting with products designed for maximum reward impact. Each crunch, fizz, or melt targets evolve signals meant to steer survival choices, now harnessed toward repeat purchases. The outcome is predictable. People overeat not because they misunderstand their needs, but because the system makes moderation far more difficult than it once was in natural food environments. This distinction also explains why the impact can feel invisible at first. Unlike lighting a cigarette, eating a bag of chips doesn't have a clear moment of risk recognition. Cravings merge with ordinary hunger until the two become hard to separate. Yet under brain imaging, the similarity to other compulsive behaviors is clear. Food doesn't get classified morally. It triggers reinforcement circuits without distinction. In this sense, the steady inability to stop at just one is less about a lack of will and more about encountering foods built to override the body's own limits. So while our brains are responding in predictable ways, the full cost isn't restricted to how many calories we eat. What's happening underneath the brain's reward response is only part of the story. The system's being hijacked don't stop at the skull. They interact with chemistry and biology throughout the entire body. New research is starting to show that ultra-processed foods alter not just motivation and hunger, but also the network of living organisms that support digestion, immunity, and even mood. And that's where the next layer of the story begins, the hidden impact on our gut microbiome. What happens inside your gut when you build a diet around ultra-processed foods? Every bite doesn't just deliver calories or vitamins, it also delivers signals to the trillions of microorganisms living along the digestive tract. These bacteria, fungi, and other microbes collectively form the gut microbiome, an ecosystem that doesn't just digest food but also helps regulate the immune system, influence metabolism, and even communicate with the brain. When diets are dominated by ultra-processed products, the inputs feeding this ecosystem change dramatically, and with them the balance of the microbes themselves. One way to make sense of this is to contrast the foods microbes prefer. Diets rich in beans, vegetables, fruits, and whole grains provide diverse plant fibers that act as fuel for beneficial bacteria. When these microbes ferment fiber, they produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, acetate, and propionate. Those compounds strengthen the gut lining, calm inflammation, and play roles in stable metabolism. A microbiome supported by plant fibers tends to be diverse, resilient, and supportive of long-term health. Ultra-processed foods reshape that environment in the opposite direction. They are typically stripped of fiber, built on refined starches, sweeteners, and additives that shift the competitive landscape inside the microbiome. This favors species that thrive on simple sugars or tolerate chemical additives, while fiber-loving species decline. Over time, this leads to fewer protective metabolites and a community that may tilt toward inflammation rather than balance. The shift isn't always immediate, but repeated exposure compiles into lasting alterations in the microbial ecosystem. Additives like emulsifiers illustrate the concern. Emulsifiers make food smoother and more stable, keeping chocolate creamy or salad dressing uniform. But in controlled studies with animals, certain emulsifiers disturb the mucus layer that separates microbes from gut tissue, increasing direct contact between bacteria and cells of the intestine. That breakdown of the barrier set the stage for low-grade inflammation, which links to metabolic conditions. Human evidence is still emerging, but one study by Ben Wilczassin in 2022 used a randomized controlled feeding design with the emulsifier carboxymethylcellulose. Participants consuming it showed measurable shifts in microbiota composition, changes in their fecal metabolome, and even reported mild gastrointestinal discomfort. This kind of direct human trial strengthens concern that emulsifiers may quietly alter the microbiome in ways that accumulate over time. Artificial sweeteners raise a separate set of questions. At first, they appear to be simple swaps, sweetness without calories. But mechanistic studies suggest that when the microbiome encounters certain sweeteners, it reorganizes in ways that can influence glucose regulation. In some people, this has been linked to higher than expected blood sugar responses, despite no sugar being consumed. These effects vary depending on the type of sweetener and the individual's existing gut community, but the key point is that gut microbes are active participants. They don't just watch ingredients pass through. They adapt, rearrange, and send metabolic signals that ripple back into how the body processes energy. Refined sugars highlight another mechanism. Because they are absorbed so quickly in the small intestine, they seldom reach the large intestine where microbes consume complex carbohydrates. That starves beneficial fiber-fermenting bacterial fuel while favoring microbes that can thrive on more accessible energy sources. Over time, this narrows microbial diversity. A less varied microbiome is less resilient, meaning it recovers more slowly from antibiotics, infection, or illness. The reduction isn't about good or bad microbes individually, it's about stability. Broad ecosystems are protective, while low-diversity environments are fragile. An important caveat here is that much of what we know about these mechanisms comes from animal research and controlled feeding studies under lab conditions. Those models show clearly how emulsifiers or sweeteners interact with microbes, but translating that directly into population-level human outcomes is more complex. Still, a growing number of human randomized trials, like the carboxymethylcellulose study, demonstrate that even short-term, tightly controlled changes in diet can reshape gut microbial populations, alter metabolite output, and affect how people feel. Evidence in people is younger than evidence in animals, but it's expanding quickly. What's troubling is that these changes often go unnoticed. You don't feel a drop in bacterial diversity or sense when protective metabolites decline. Yet the microbiome constantly feeds messages into your physiology. Research connects changes in microbial communities not just to digestion, but also to immune training and mood regulation. Studies linked altered microbiota with higher risk of anxiety and depression, and with immune systems that struggle to distinguish true threats from harmless inputs. Metabolic differences are traced back as well. Some microbial fingerprints correspond with greater fat storage, even when calorie input is the same. Looking at the metabolites best illustrates the difference. Fiber-fermenting bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids that strengthen colon cells, regulate appetite, and even send stability signals that support mental health. Diets dominated by ultra-processed foods generally reduce these protective chemicals. Instead, byproducts of sugar-dominant and additive-favoring microbes become more common, many of which are less beneficial. That change doesn't show up on a nutrition label, yet it alters the chemistry shaping both metabolism and mood. Another concern lies with immune system training. A fiber-supported microbiome helps immune cells calibrate when to attack and when to tolerate. This builds resilience. Inflammation spikes when needed and subsides after. By contrast, microbiomes altered by additives and sweeteners can push immune signals toward chronic low-grade inflammation. From the outside, that looks like a body constantly simmering. Research links that state that cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and even disorders of the nervous system. Even in the absence of obvious digestive problems, the immune tone shifts. What makes the microbiome so dynamic is its speed of response. Unlike human cells, bacteria can evolve and reorganize within days, shift to a diet of mostly ultra-processed products, and within weeks changes in microbial diversity become detectable. Switching back toward legumes, vegetables, and whole grains often revives some lost microbial activity as well, but not always all of it. When a community loses certain species for too long, they may not return, much like species extinction in larger ecosystems. That's why long-term patterns of consumption carry more weight than occasional exposures. The growing research forces a reframing of processed foods beyond added sugar or fat levels. Even seemingly minor additives measured in grams or milligrams can reshape gut ecosystems, alter metabolite production, and press on immune and neurological pathways in subtle ways. The consequences are ecological rewrites happening inside the body. What seems like a harmless stabilizer or sweetener on a label signals directly to microbes, which in turn send messages that influence inflammation, energy balance, and mood. For practical purposes, this means that ultra-processed foods act on two levels: the brain's reward pathways encouraging overconsumption, and the gut microbiome reprogramming internal systems that decide how the body handles those calories afterward. That combination helps explain why the long-term effects are harder to separate from simple willpower or diet tracking. They're embedded in the invisible networks that sustain energy, immunity, and emotional balance. A simple takeaway is worth keeping in mind. While complete avoidance of all additives is unrealistic, reducing frequent exposure to emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners is a small, evidence-aligned step that supports microbial resilience. Choosing whole foods with natural fiber more often, even in modest amounts, strengthens the bacteria that provide protected metabolites. The goal isn't perfection, but shifting the balance toward inputs that sustain microbial diversity rather than erode it. And this perspective raises an even bigger point. Processing isn't only preserving or altering nutrients. Increasingly, it's about how technology interacts with the ecosystems inside us. The same industrial methods that stabilize a bottle of dressing or sweeten a diet, soda now touch microbiome systems in ways scientists are only starting to map. And if current research shows that even small additives have system-wide consequences, the future of food science points towards something even more radical, where processing no longer just extends shelf life, but fundamentally reimagines what food itself can be. Food tech, straight out of science fiction. Picture tomorrow's dinner. Not food stored longer or flavored differently, but food built using techniques that would have sounded impossible just a generation ago. The conversation around food tech straight out of science fiction isn't about mainstream supermarket products yet. It's about emerging fields shaping the research edge of food processing. What's striking is not just how these developments expand the toolkit, but how they follow directly from the lineage of earlier processing breakthroughs, from canning and pasteurization to freeze-drying and industrial fractionation. Each leap redefined how food was made, stored, or delivered. Today's experiments continue that same trajectory, only with more precision and more complex goals in mind. One of the most discussed frontiers is precision fermentation. Unlike traditional fermentation used for bread, beer, or yogurt, this approach trains microbes like yeast or bacteria to produce specific proteins, fats, or flavor compounds. Scientists encode new instructions in the microbial DNA, turning them into microscopic factories. Instead of harvesting milk from cows, for example, you can instruct yeast to generate proteins that behave like dairy proteins. Blended with stabilizers and natural flavor components, they create products close to cheese or ice cream, but without relying on conventional animal farming. These efforts remain in early adoption phases, but they demonstrate how industrial-scale fermentation can create familiar ingredients in more controlled and potentially more sustainable ways. The logic behind these microbial systems is efficiency. With the right feedstock, microbes multiply endlessly, producing targeted compounds in controlled tanks rather than across fields or barns. That means generating ingredients like enzymes, vitamins, or proteins without the land, water, and methane output associated with large herds or crops. The technology is not fully mainstream. Most products made this way are still in trial markets or pilot facilities, but it shows how far processing extends beyond preserving food into recreating the very building blocks food is made from. A related tool is fractionation, breaking raw materials into functional parts for recombination into new products. This isn't futuristic so much as industrial, but advances have made it possible to extract highly specific proteins, fibers, and micronutrient fractions from plants or grains with unusual precision. Think of it this way. Instead of milling wheat just into flour, fractionation allows food designers to isolate gluten proteins, soluble fibers, or minor compounds separately, then recombine them for targeted purposes, like creating pasta with higher protein, or bread that maintains texture while lowering glycemic impact. These techniques don't create entirely new foods, but they allow foods to be engineered in a more modular way than traditional agriculture ever could. Researchers are also exploring sustainable processing strategies that go beyond simply making food taste good or last longer. One example is using microbial or enzymatic methods to replace chemical processes. Certain enzymes can restructure plant proteins so they mimic the texture of meat without heavy additives, while others allow oils to be stabilized without synthetic preservatives. These fields are developing not ubiquitous in grocery aisles, but they suggest that tomorrow's processing may rely less on artificial chemistry and more on biologically efficient machinery already encoded in microbes. That's where the conversation often expands into what role artificial intelligence might play in shaping future foods. Today, food formulation still involves a large amount of trial and error. Developing a product that is flavorful, stable, nutritious, and affordable remains a complicated balancing act. AI systems trained on large sets of nutritional and sensory data are being tested as tools to speed up this development. They can predict how altering texture ingredients might affect both shelf stability and consumer experience, or how swapping a fiber type might change absorption and gut response. In theory, such modeling could eventually allow mass personalization of food to individual nutritional profiles, though that potential is still speculative. For now, researchers describe it as an emerging tool to inform development rather than an overhaul of the industry. Another line of progress involves sustainability challenges. As global demand for protein rises, alternative sources, from legumes and algae to insect meal, are being studied as inputs for new processed products. Insects, for instance, carry stigma as whole foods, but can be fractionated into powders that blend seamlessly into noodles or snack bars, delivering high protein and micronutrient density with far lower environmental footprint than livestock. Processing becomes critical here because it removes the visible cues people might resist and embeds the nutritional benefits into more familiar forms. While consumer acceptance varies, the research is moving forward because the ecological map makes sense. The role of industrial fermentation and enzymatic modification isn't limited to protein. These methods can generate vitamins or rare bioactive compounds that otherwise occur in only trace amounts in nature. That means consistent access to nutrients without needing vast harvests of rare plants or animals. In practice, this could stabilize the supply of essential micronutrients, especially in regions where deficiencies remain common. Again, this isn't yet everyday supermarket reality, but it represents the direction of ongoing exploration, using biological systems to fill dietary gaps more efficiently than agriculture alone can. Skepticism is common when these technologies are discussed. Many people wonder why food should be made in vats or labs when farms already exist. Scientists and industry researchers frame it differently, as complementary, not replacements. Traditional farming provides cultural and sensory value, but new processing methods may buffer against climate instability, resource limitations, and nutritional inequity. With the population increasing and land stress, these tools represent options to diversify food supply chains rather than eliminate existing ones. It's also important to emphasize the stage of development. Most of these technologies, precision fermentation, advanced fractionation, AI-aided design, are research-driven and not yet widely available. Their long-term effects on health, ecosystems, and economies remain subjects of study. Regulatory agencies are still evaluating their safety and assessing where they fit within existing food systems. Though while the images of lab-engineered milk proteins or insect-derived baking flour spark attention, they should be understood as examples of directions being tested, not shifts already established in everyday meals. What ties these threads together is a broader change in how food is conceived. The same way pasteurization once transformed milk safety or freeze-drying transformed shelf stability, modern research aims not simply to preserve or transport food, but to build versions adapted to new constraints. That might mean proteins crafted without animals, vitamins scaled without agriculture, or formulations designed with greater precision. Whether these innovations reach mass adoption quickly or slowly, they highlight how processing has become a platform for invention as much as preservation. But while the promise of these tools is real, they also raise a deeper question. People often treat natural as equivalent to good and assume anything engineered must be worse. Yet history shows that interventions like pasteurization, fortification, and safe preservation dramatically improve public health. As new food tech pushes further, the tension around natural versus processed becomes one of the most persistent myths shaping our choices. And unpacking that myth requires looking at why the label natural is not always the guarantee of health, it seems to be. The myth of natural versus processed. One of the biggest stumbling blocks in conversations about food is the belief that natural always equals safe and healthy, while processed always equals artificial and harmful. The word natural has a kind of halo effect. It suggests purity, wholesomeness, something closer to the source. Packages plastered across their labels, usually with earth tones and leaves, sending the message that untouched means superior. But nature doesn't automatically translate to nutrition, nor does processing guarantee loss. A quick look at some of the strongest case studies in food history shows just how misleading this binary really is. Start with raw milk. Supporters often call it the pure form of milk, unheated and closer to what comes from the cow. The assumption is that nothing is lost in translation, but what is often forgotten is that raw milk carries a very real risk of contamination. Before pasteurization, raw milk was a common vector for pathogens like Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli. Outbreaks were widespread and often serious. Pasteurization, just heating the milk enough to kill harmful microbes, didn't wipe out nutrients like protein or calcium. What it did do was save lives. This simple processing step drastically reduced milk-borne disease. Here, the raw version feels natural, but it's the processed one that protects public health. Juice tells a similar story. Freshly squeezed juice looks like the definition of clean, plant-based living. Many people assume it must always be better than its pasteurized counterpart. But raw juice is unstable. Vitamin C begins degrading within hours. Oxygen exposure speeds nutrient loss, and any hygiene slip in preparation opens the door to pathogens. Heat-treating juice before bottling might sound harsher, but it halts microbial risk and helps nutrients remain intact longer. The raw option might feel authentic, but it spoils quickly and can be less reliable nutritionally. The processed juice, by contrast, delivers safety and stability. Freezing vegetables offers another powerful counterpoint. A bag of spinach picked, blanched, and frozen the same day retains vitamin levels far longer than bunches shipped across states, sitting in warehouses and spending a week in the fridge. On the surface, the fresh bag of greens looks unprocessed and superior. In practice, nutrient testing shows the frozen version often beats it in key vitamins like folate and C. Processing here acts less like modification and more like time freeze. It locks in what would otherwise fade. If natural really meant healthier in every case, these comparisons wouldn't keep showing the opposite. The idea also breaks down when considering spoilage. Natural food is perishable by default because microbes are natural too. Mold, yeast, and bacteria can override clean labels quickly. A preservative can prevent food from going bad before it's eaten. That doesn't mean all preservatives are nutritionally beneficial, but it illustrates how small amounts of processing can reduce waste, prevent illness, and ensure people actually benefit from the food they purchase. Refusing all preservatives for the sake of purity can mean more throwaway food and higher risk of eating something past its safe window. History provides two clear public health wins that highlight the value of processing. Vitamin D fortification of milk, launched in the early 20th century, wiped out rickets in large parts of the world. Without it, natural milk left many children deficient, causing bone softening and long-term health consequences. The addition of iodine to table salt produced a similar shift by preventing goiter, once endemic in many regions. Both interventions represent deliberate processing steps, adding nutrients nature didn't consistently provide, and both changed entire disease landscapes within a generation. Sprouts are one more cautionary case. They fit perfectly into the natural ideal. Raw, fresh, bright, and marketed as nutrient-dense superfoods. Yet sprouts are grown in warm, humid conditions that bacteria also love. Outbreak after outbreak has been traced back to them because they're difficult to sanitize without destroying their delicate form. On the other hand, processed alternatives made with light cooking or wash treatments reduce those pathogen risks dramatically while leaving nutrition largely intact. Again, the natural option feels helpful while hiding very real hazards. What runs through all of these examples is that naturalness is an image, not a guarantee. Food safety is a matter of biology and chemistry, not marketing language. Processing doesn't automatically strip foods of value. Many methods act as shields against nutrient loss or microbial harm. Freezing spinach, pasteurizing milk, fortifying salt, all of these fit the label of processed, and yet they are among the most impactful steps in improving human nutrition and survival across the past century. By contrast, clinging to an idealized raw or organic appearance can leave people more vulnerable to pathogens, toxin exposure, or slow nutrient decline. The myth persists because it's psychologically easy. Nature feels safe, familiar, ancestral. Machines feel cold, artificial, detached from tradition. But germs and nutrient breakdown don't pause because something looks fresh. Processing is not the villain. It's a collection of tools. Some tools cause problems when misused, like stripping grains into refined starches or layering products with excess sugars. But others prevent those problems, ensuring cleaner outcomes than nature on its own can provide. For everyday choices, this distinction matters. Judging food by whether it's labeled natural or processed is misleading because the labels themselves filter the wrong details. What should matter is what each processing step actually does. Does it enhance safety, retain nutrients, or reduce deficiencies? Or does it strip out value and add unnecessary sugars? Pasteurization, freezing, and fortification are examples of the first category. Refining flour until only starch remains belongs to the second. The case-by-case evaluation cuts through the illusion of a simple natural versus processed divide. A useful rule of thumb is to ask, what is this processing step achieving? If it locks in nutrition, eliminates pathogens, or fills gaps that nature leaves inconsistent, then it is working in favor of health. If it removes valuable components and replaces them with chemical shortcuts to flavor or shelf life, then it leans toward harm. This framework is far more practical than clinging to an emotional label. It draws on what research actually shows instead of what packaging wants people to feel. And once we reframe the debate this way, a new question comes into focus. If processing can protect us, stabilize nutrition, and even add missing nutrients, what happens when it pushes further, not just into safety, but into shaping our experience of taste itself? Are ultra-processed foods rewiring our taste buds? Do ultra-processed foods actually reshape what we perceive food is supposed to taste like? That's the question many researchers are exploring, and the picture is more complex than just eating too much junk food. If taste worked like an unchanging sensor, then broccoli or plain rice would always taste the same, regardless of what else filled your diet. But taste is dynamic. It adapts to repeated inputs, recalibrating both sensitivity and preference over time. Which means the more often we expose our palates to foods designed for maximum pleasure, the flatter and less rewarding natural foods can seem by comparison. For most of human history, flavors were relatively moderate. Sweetness came primarily from ripe fruits or small amounts of honey. Salt appeared only in limited quantities, and fatty richness came in small doses from meat or nuts. Contrast that to the concentrated environments of modern packaged foods, snacks engineered to maximize sweetness, saltiness, savoriness, and crunch. Beverages flood the tongue with sugar. Chips are layered with salt and seasonings, and meals come loaded with emulsifiers and flavor boosters. Foods like these aren't simply tasty. They are fine-tuned to push sensory rewards as high as possible. Over time, the experience of good flavor shifts as the palate adapts upward. What was once flavorful now seems muted. Think of taste like a sound system with a volume knob. Natural foods play at a moderate level, while ultra-processed options crank the volume much higher. After spending hours exposed to that louder range, returning to natural medium flavors feels weak or disappointing. A steamed carrot or a bowl of beans hasn't changed, but compared to processed meals, the signals feel faint. Over time, this recalibration influences how satisfying or unsatisfying different foods seem. Studies suggest this adaptation is not just theoretical. Taste responsiveness appears to shift with diet patterns. People who regularly consume sugary drinks often require higher sugar concentrations before identifying flavors as sweet. Those who snack frequently on salty chips are less likely to detect subtle saltiness in unprocessed meals. Instead of every taste experience being anchored to the same baseline, the detection threshold itself moves. It's not that vegetables contain less flavor, it's that the palate has been conditioned to expect extremes. The same applies to other basic tastes like umami. Mushrooms, beans, or Parmesan contain naturally moderate amounts of glutamate, which gives them savory appeal. But processed soups, instant noodles, and ready-made sauces often carry concentrated levels of glutamates or yeast extracts. The saturation of these flavors can normalize intense umami, leaving plain bean soup or homemade broth tasting bland by comparison. The consequence is that processed foods don't just mask other foods, they train us to recalibrate. Expectations upward. Texture also plays a critical role. Food scientists design consistent crunch in chips, balanced fizz in sodas, and uniform creaminess in desserts. By comparison, natural foods feel inconsistent. Apples may vary in crispness, nuts in richness, bread in density. Once hyper-consistent textures become normal in a diet, these natural variations can seem underwhelming. The body doesn't simply taste flavor. It experiences texture, speed of breakdown, and oral sensation. Studies led by Kieran Ford and others show that texture strongly affects eating speed and fullness signaling. Processed foods optimized for softness or crunch tend to be consumed more rapidly, reducing the opportunity for satiety cues to catch up. That faster intake, combined with high energy density, drives overeating. This behavioral mechanism shows why processed diets blunt appreciation for whole foods. Hall's 2019 inpatient trial highlighted this. Participants on an ultra-processed diet ate about 500 more calories per day compared with minimally processed diets, largely because they consumed foods faster and in larger portions. Repeated exposure to hyper-palatable textures and flavors reinforces eating patterns that plain foods cannot compete with, not just because they taste weaker, but because they deliver slower, calmer sensory signals. The good news is that this adaptation is not permanent. Studies that reduce participants' intake of added sugars or processed snacks report that after several weeks, natural foods regain appeal. Fruits taste sweeter than remembered. Whole grains feel richer. Subtle flavors that once seemed boring begin to stand out again. This shows that taste recalibration works in both directions. Deny the palate constant, high-intensity rewards, and sensitivity adjust downward toward the natural range. However, the process takes time, usually weeks of consistent effort, not days. At first, food may feel bland during adjustment, but once the threshold resets, natural variations feel rewarding again. Still, this creates a loop of reinforcement that is hard to escape. If plain foods feel unsatisfying compared with processed ones, people are more likely to relapse into the stronger flavors, restarting the cycle. The result is a pattern where cravings are less about hunger and more about sensory conditioning. Over years, individual palates shift toward preferring products that offer little nutritional balance but high reward intensity, shaping cultural notions of what good food should taste like. This conditioning spans beyond individuals. Generations raised on sweetened cereals, snack cakes, and fast food consistently grow up with expectations that vegetables are boring or that treats taste the way food is supposed to taste. That pattern becomes part of cultural memory, passed through marketing and habits until natural foods are seen as lacking by default. But it's not biology setting those preferences, it's exposure. Culture and diet train both our palates and our expectations. Researchers also point out that these processes affect satiety cues. Foods dense in sugar, refined fat, and salt are digested quickly, giving rapid energy but muted long-term fullness. In contrast, high-fiber, minimally processed foods digest more slowly, sending stronger satiety signals. With repeated exposure, the brain begins to expect rapid satisfaction, leaving slower, steadier foods feeling inadequate. This helps explain why meals built from vegetables or whole grains often leave people reaching for snacks afterward. The contrast is not in calories but in timing and conditioned response. Fat acceptance works similarly. Heavy cream sauces, fried foods, or processed spreads teach the brain to associate fullness with high levels of fat. Natural fatty foods like nuts or oily fish register as less indulgent despite being nutritionally dense. The more often the brain experiences these amplified foods, the higher the threshold becomes before fat feels satisfying. Perception itself becomes altered. fueling further overconsumption. So are ultra-processed foods rewiring our taste buds? The evidence suggests they are shaping sensitivity and preferences in ways that raise the threshold for enjoyment. The more those foods dominate, the harder it becomes for minimally processed foods to compete, not because they are innately bland, but because sensory expectations have been trained elsewhere. This makes the act of returning to whole foods feel like a downgrade, even though it reflects a reset back toward the original baseline. The encouraging takeaway is that recalibration is possible. By limiting exposure to highly processed foods and allowing several weeks of adjustment, the palate can recover sensitivity. Fruits become more appealing, plain grains more flavorful, and small amounts of salt or sugar more pronounced. But this requires conscious consistency. Otherwise, the cycle of hyper-flavor reinforcement pulls people back. The larger implication is that when processing influences not just nutrition but sensory baselines, we begin to redefine what foods people believe are satisfying. This alters diets and eventually health. Which raises the next urgent question. If ultra-processed foods can shift how things taste, how much are they also shaping broader outcomes? The weight we carry, our risk of disease, and even our mood. Health outcomes linked to processing in 2025. For years, the science around diet and health left a critical gap. Observational research kept showing that people who ate the most ultra-processed foods were more likely to develop things like obesity, heart disease, or depression, but skeptics pushed back. Maybe it wasn't the processing itself. Maybe those diets just had more sugar, fat, and salt. Or maybe people who ate more packaged foods simply had other lifestyle patterns that explained the link. Correlation isn't causation, and for a long time that made it easy to question whether processing really mattered in its own right. By 2025, that picture has shifted. For the first time, multiple randomized controlled trials directly compared diets built around ultra-processed foods with diets centered on minimally processed alternatives. Rather than depending on broad food surveys or self-reported choices, researchers controlled what participants ate and tracked everything from body composition to blood chemistry to mood. That makes a difference. It moved the evidence base away from these groups look different toward these choices produce different outcomes. With that step, the argument that ultra-processed foods are only guilty by association became much harder to sustain. Weight gain is the clearest case. In one widely cited trial, Kevin Hall and his colleagues at the NIH 2019 provided participants with two diets matched in calories, sugar, fat, fiber, and protein on paper. When given access to the ultra-processed version, people ate about 500 calories more per day than they did on the minimally processed diet, without even realizing it. They reported similar levels of hunger, yet their intake climbed anyway. By the end of 2 weeks, participants on ultra-processed meals gained noticeable body fat, while those on minimally processed meals lost weight. That was the first clear proof that processing, not just nutrients, influences intake and storage. More recently, a 2025 Nature Medicine study by Dicken and colleagues extended this finding. It showed that participants prescribed a minimally processed eating plan actually experienced greater weight loss compared to those on an ultra-processed diet, even when energy and macronutrients were matched. Together, these trials confirmed something years of observation had only hinted at. The structure and design of industrial foods change how the body responds, independent of what's written on the nutrition label. The implications extend beyond weight. Controlled trials and laboratory measurements have shown that ultra-processed diets alter glucose control and insulin sensitivity, suggesting part of diabetes risk is tied to processing itself. Participants consuming equally sugary diets but in ultra-processed form had larger blood sugar spikes and more rapid shifts toward insulin resistance. That indicates that the physical breakdown of foods, extrusion, emulsification, fine grinding, alters digestion and absorption speed, taxing metabolic pathways more aggressively than whole or minimally altered foods. Cardiovascular markers show similar divergences. LDL, cholesterol, and triglycerides often rise on ultra-processed diets, while HDL, or good cholesterol, tends to drop. Again, these effects weren't purely about fat quantity. They reflected how nutrients were packaged. Highly engineered matrices delivered calories quickly, with few buffering fibers or protective phytochemicals, and this reshaping elicits changes in lipid profiles that observational studies have long connected to higher risk for heart disease. Mental health is another area of growing attention. Past epidemiological work suggested eating patterns rich in ultra-processed foods correlated with higher risk of depression and anxiety. Critics argued this could just reflect overall lifestyle differences, but in 2025, controlled feeding studies went a step further. Participants consuming mostly ultra-processed meals reported worse mood scores, higher fatigue, and more irritability compared with those on minimally processed diets. Biological markers like cortisol and inflammatory measures shifted in parallel. It's an early but striking suggestion that processing may affect brain-related outcomes via mechanisms that likely include the microbiome, immune signaling, and blood sugar regulation. Still, it's important to keep claims in perspective. Much of what we know about long-term risk, including type 2 diabetes progression, cardiovascular disease, and all-cause mortality, still comes from observational data. Meta-analyses of prospective cohorts consistently show associations between high ultra-processed consumption and worse health outcomes, but causality is complex and influenced by cultural and social variables. What's new is that controlled experiments increasingly replicate those associations on shorter timescales in ways that isolate processing as a factor. That combination, large-scale observation plus targeted trials, creates a body of evidence that is difficult to ignore. The mechanisms under study point to several overlapping explanations. One is satiety, or the lack of it. Foods that are mechanically broken down, low in intact fiber, and engineered for palatability are digested quickly. Participants in feeding trials consistently consume more calories per minute when eating ultra-processed meals, and they felt hungry again sooner. The food matrix, how structural components like fiber and starch resist breakdown, matters as much as calorie count. When the matrix is destroyed, nutrients flood into the bloodstream too quickly, leading to rapid swings in glucose and insulin. The body registers energy, but not fullness, driving a feedback loop toward overeating. Inflammation is another dimension. Many studies now show people on ultra-processed diets display higher levels of C-reactive protein, a marker of systemic inflammation. While the specific drivers remain under investigation, hypotheses include microbial disturbances from emulsifiers and sweeteners, immune responses to food additives, and the absence of anti-inflammatory compounds typically preserved in whole foods. Chronic, low-grade inflammation connects to a wide range of outcomes from cardiovascular strain to mood disorders, making this one of the most important mechanisms under exploration. The global breadth of evidence also deserves mention. Ultra-processed foods are no longer restricted to North America or Europe. Controlled feeding and cohort studies now include populations in Asia and South America, and the findings align. Higher intake patterns bring similar metabolic, cardiovascular, and mental health challenges regardless of cultural background or cuisine traditions. That universality suggests the link is not just about Western lifestyle, but about something common to the properties of ultra-processed foods themselves. So what does that mean for nutrition guidance? For decades, dietary advice fixated on individual nutrients. Avoid saturated fat, limit sugar, get more fiber. Those principles are still valid, but trials in 2019 and 2025 show that food processing exerts its own independent influence. Two diets with identical macros can drive different outcomes if one is built from intact foods and the other from heavily engineered products. Nutrient math alone no longer explains the difference. Processing, the way the food is broken down, recombined, and delivered, emerges as a risk factor worth considering in its own right. At the same time, it's essential not to lump all processing together. Preservation techniques like freezing or pasteurization prevent spoilage without producing the metabolic shifts seen in ultra-processed formulations. Nutrient fortification has eliminated devastating deficiency diseases. The concern arises when processing goes beyond preservation, restructuring foods into systems with little resemblance to their natural starting point. It is that category, the ultra-processed, that consistently aligns with higher risk. When you look across the evidence, epidemiological associations, mechanistic animal studies, and now several human randomized trials, the pattern grows clearer. Diets dominated by ultra-processed foods increase the likelihood of weight gain, metabolic disruption, cardiovascular strain, inflammation, and even lower mood. The impacts are not explained away by sugar, salt, and fat alone. They arise from how industrial processing systematically alters the physical and chemical form of food. That leads to a simple but powerful takeaway for 2025. Not every type of processing is harmful, but when foods are restructured to the point where satiety signals weaken, absorption accelerates, and additives disrupt balance, the health costs become visible. Different tools of processing carry very different consequences. Knowing which is which has become one of the most important tasks in modern nutrition science. And this leaves us with a larger perspective worth carrying forward. Processing itself is shaping our diets and our health, but the affect depends entirely on how it's used. Some methods of processing safeguard nutrients, extend safety, and even make foods more widely available than nature alone could. Others reshape foods so thoroughly that they fuel overeating, alter metabolism, and shift the gut environment in ways that raise health risks. The difference isn't about the label processed itself, but what each step of processing accomplishes. The practical takeaway is simple. Choose minimally processed, nutrient-preserving foods most of the time and treat ultra-processed options as occasional extras rather than daily staples. Read labels, prioritize whole ingredients, and stay curious about how food science shapes what ends up on your plate. Which processed foods surprise you most? Frozen vegetables, canned tomatoes, or something else? Share your thoughts in the comments.